Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Carlson-Mast. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of President Lincoln's Cottage, and we're delighted to welcome you all here today to our third annual Lincoln Ideas Forum, which explores the intersection between Lincoln's life and legacy and contemporary issues. This program is one of the powerful ways in which we seek to understand how our past informs our present. As evidenced of what has and hasn't worked, this isn't an exercise in nostalgia, but rather a way of giving us hope that there's a path to greater freedom, justice, and equality. This year, our theme is Hate of the Nation. That might seem a curious title when we're seeking hope. Sometimes people say, oh goodness, we're so divided, there's so much injustice in the world, so much hate, so much fear, it can't get any worse. As historians, we're sometimes in the unenviable, maybe, position of telling people actually it can get a lot worse. But we don't say that as a way of dashing hope, but rather as a means of preventing utter despair. We're resilient. Lincoln believed that the deep-rooted principles of hate and the powerful motive of revenge could be trampled and overcome, leading to greater national unity. And interesting that quote from Lincoln, the deep-rooted principles of hate and the powerful motive of revenge, are not about the Civil War, but were rather said 20 years earlier, reflecting on the American Revolution. I'm as eager as all of you to hear from our invited speakers, so let's go ahead and get things started. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Laura Schiavo. Dr. Schiavo is the Assistant Professor of Museum Studies at the George Washington University. She received her BA from Wesleyan University and her PhD in American Studies from the George Washington University in 2003. She has taught a variety of classes in the American Studies program as a teaching assistant, an instructor, and a visiting assistant professor. Dr. Schiavo has extensive experience in curatorial, collections, and exhibition practice. Her past positions include serving as the exhibitions curator of the City Museum, the director of museum programs, Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington, and most recently as a senior curator at the National Building Museum. She's also a member of our scholarly advisory group. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schiavo.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to Lincoln's Cottage for having me here to moderate this really fascinating panel. I'm honored to play even a small role in the discussion today, sharing the stage with these panelists who have done and continue to do such important work in documenting and in understanding hate and its consequences, including the impact of hate on policy, and the important work of how we hold people together through conflict. And I'm especially honored to be sharing the stage with Dory Ladner, who put her life on the line to defy the hateful policies of segregation. And like all of us, I'm sure I'm humbled to speak to you in this very room, where, to use the words of President Lincoln's Cottage, some truly brave ideas were transformed into a proclamation. So I am a cultural historian by training. I am a former curator and a professor of museum studies now. And my brief comments, I hope, will help us think about some strategies, the hopeful part of this, for working with people whose lives are impacted by hate and hatefulness, which is basically all of us in differing degrees, to think about origins, history, and the connections between past and present. So as I thought about the perspective that I would bring to this discussion, I was somewhat surprised to realize that today I present a more hopeful tone than the one I bring to many conversations in which I take part. I teach the history and theory of museums. This means I spend many hours in seminars reviewing and analyzing the history of museums, a history that has, for a long time now in this country, depending on where you start it, been largely a story of collecting and exhibiting the material culture and in some case the bodies of colonized peoples on the one hand and celebrating whiteness and privilege on the other, the latter often under the guise of hallowed sites of shared national memory that deny the complexity of the history told there by ignoring the varied positions of those who participated in that history, or by selecting particular sites and objects as worthy of memory. So of course, there are museums and historic sites, President Lincoln's Cottage outstanding among them, that do something very different. These places become sites for engaging critically with the past, sparking discussion and debate, and helping to enact a different kind of citizen than the citizens that those were imagined by museums in an earlier time. The citizens we hope to form are visitors who leave our sites more engaged with the complexity of history and its connections to the contemporary, and more willing or able or emboldened to be part of a conversation about how we want the future to look. So despite these successes and these museums like Lincoln's Cottage of the past few decades, for much of my teaching, I'm the bearer of bad tidings, exploring a very troubling museum past with students who love museums and want to work in them. And it's not easy always to come up with a wholly satisfactory answer about how to truly change the narrative when often our collections are ill-gotten, our staffs rarely represent the racial or economic, socioeconomic, or ethnic demographics of our nation, and too often attempts at community collaboration can end up just replicating the power dynamics that they're meant to destabilize. So I often deliver the bad news. But today, I think I can wear a different hat, a hopeful hat, one in which history and historical legacy might shift from culprit to possible savior. In her book, Talking to Strangers, political scientist Danielle Allen, whose work some of you may know, wrote, "The number one thing to remember about distrust is that it's historical. When distrust comes as a surprise within a city, odds are that different communities within it have developed pretty separate versions of history without anyone's noticing. When community members get out of sync, it's important to go back and look at historical events and weave our narratives together." So I think we can use this seemingly obvious but rarely so clearly spoken idea that distrust is historical to note that the same may be true of hate. Hatred and distrust are closely connected. So we might rewrite Allen's words to say that hate is historical, too. Not only in that its manifestations and implications change over time, but in that its current formations are rooted in history. And those on opposite sides have, quote, developed pretty separate versions of history without anyone's noticing. So if you can keep that in the back of your head, I'd like to return to this idea after we have heard from our speakers. And I want to suggest to you that if hate and distrust are historical, then history may also provide some solutions to its at least partial undoing, and to suggest that museums and other sites of civic engagement like President Lincoln's Cottage become important not only for what they represent about the past, but as places to imagine a better future. So I will leave it at that for now and begin to introduce our speakers. I'll introduce each speaker. That person will speak, and then I will introduce our next speaker. Everyone will speak for about 18 to 20 minutes, and then there'll be a few minutes in between for us to re-mic and reconfigure, and you'll have a little time to stretch. So I am pleased to introduce first Ms. Dory Ladner. Ms. Ladner is a civil rights activist who first became involved in the NAACP as an adolescent in Hattiesburg, Mississippi's youth chapter. Ladner was drawn to the civil rights movement after the murder of Emmett Till. In the early 1960s, she joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and became one of the founding members of the Council of Federated Organizations, which sponsored the Freedom Summer Project in 1964. She participated in every civil rights march from 1963 to 1968. In 1973, Ms. Ladner earned her BA from Tougaloo College and moved to Washington, D.C., where she enrolled at the Howard University School of Social Work and earned her MSW. Ms. Ladner served as a clinical social worker in Washington, D.C. for 30 years, and since retirement has continued her work as a social activist. Ms. Ladner's talk today is entitled, "We Who Want Freedom Cannot Resist." Cannot rest. We must resist, we cannot rest. Ms. Ladner.
Interested in the Lincoln Cottage. I've driven past here many times, and it was referred to as the soldier's home, but I had no idea that all this was here. And more humble to be in the area where President Lincoln drafted the Emancipation, which was very vital to all of us, especially people of color, 13, 14, and 15 amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America, 13th abolishing slavery, citizenship, with the 14th and 15th the right to vote. Unfortunately, the president expired or was killed before.
Could you speak up, please?
Sure. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Unfortunately, the President Lincoln was murdered before the 15th Amendment was ratified. I, being a native of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and came along I was around the time of Emmett Till's death, a young black man who was murdered in the state of Mississippi by 2 white men. And I was so traumatized by his murder and identified with him, although he lived maybe 250 miles from me. I was in the extreme south near Louisiana, and he was on the border of Tennessee. And reading the Hattiesburg American newspaper every day, I came across the 13, 14, and 15 amendments to the Constitution in the paper. And I had never heard of a Constitution. You must remember that where I grew up, we didn't have books to read. We didn't have access to, I lived on an apartheid system. Blacks was rigidly segregated. We couldn't go to the library. Schools were segregated. We had 3rd and 4th hand school books. And so we lived in separate parts of the communities. And, but the Hattiesburg American was a moderate newspaper. And we would get it every day and read it, the Hattiesburg American. So when I came across the 13th, 14th Amendment to the Constitution during the trial of the 2 men who murdered Emmett Till, it was like, what does this mean? I'd never heard of a Constitution. So I went to school and I asked my social studies teacher, Mr. Clark, what does this mean? What does the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution mean? No, what does 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution mean? That just has something to do with the Constitution, and he threw his hand and walked away. I went and found a copy of the Constitution of the United States of America and took it, and I memorized those articles. And I memorized because I had felt so powerless, so identified with young Emmett Till, who was a year older than I was, and I said, maybe if I learn this, it will help me with my plight in the community. But see, I didn't grow up in a very hostile environment. Hattiesburg, Mississippi was close to the Gulf of Mexico and also close to New Orleans, and it wasn't a farming area. So I felt that if I memorized these, it would put me closer to, I didn't know all about the federal government and all that either, but I felt it would help me. And so from there, I started out with the Constitution in my head, and I felt somewhat empowered. And that was 1955. And along the way, having encountered the late Clyde Kennard, who was arrested for allegedly stealing 5 sacks of stolen chicken feed and sent to Parchment Penitentiary for 7 years of hard labor. Mr. Vernon Damer, who was murdered coming out of his house after he attempted to save his life by the Ku Klux Klan. I'm reliving all these kinds of things because comparing and contrasting after the emancipation was passed and President Lincoln had been assassinated, the black codes were enacted about 1870, a little later, and I'm seeing myself going through the same kinds of things at that particular period in 1960, because I don't know, the state of Mississippi became very hostile and combative around that time. The Freedom Riders were saying that they were coming to the state, and a lot of things were happening, and Medgar Evers was murdered. Mr. Herbert Lee was murdered for attempting to register to vote, and many things took place. But one of the most horrible acts that happened was Mr. Vernon Damer, who lived outside of Hattiesburg city limits. Home was firebombed, and his family was able to get out. Mr. Damer was a NAACP president, and he would pay poll taxes. See, the poll taxes were enacted around 1870, not 1870, around 1880 or something, because the state of Mississippi in 1896 decided that they weren't going to let any black people vote, because after Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce came to the Congress here, Bruce was a senator, and also Hiram Revels, and you had John R. Lynch, who served here for a good while as a representative. All these things are coming to me, and forgive me for being a little jumbled, but we could not vote. I'm going to take it back to the voting. We could not vote from about 1896 until 1965, and I'll leave that and I'll come back. But being a young college student coming to, I had to leave Hattiesburg, Mississippi in order to go to college, and that was 90 miles north of Jackson State, where I was expelled for praying a prayer in the dorm. I had no idea that asking God, let there be peace in the world, would get me on the bad side of the dean and this president. It was a state school, Jackson State. I just couldn't believe it. I knew Mr. Medgar Evers, whose office was across the street from Jackson State. And on Wednesdays, we would go to his office and talk to him, because he was a man who had a vision, and he said that if we worked hard, we would get our freedom. And freedom for me was abstract. I was 19 years old, 18, 19 years old, and I said, I want my freedom because I had been exposed to this apartheid system. If any way that I could help me get my freedom. But Mr. Evers was able to communicate with us, because he was a man who could communicate with young people such as myself, and also with my mother. He told us that our parents paid taxes and we should have access to all the public accommodations, and we should have street lights, we should have paved streets. And on the other hand, he's telling our parents that they were paying taxes and they should be entitled to the same things. And it made sense to me. So when I got to Jackson State and met other young people, I also met James Meredith, who had just come home from the military with his wife, and we began to talk to them, and we had similar views and started strategizing. And it resulted in us attempting to march with the Tougaloo students who attempted to sit in at the library in Jackson, Mississippi. That was one of the first marches in the state of Mississippi. We were tear gassed, and I still carry scars from that. It's a very unfortunate situation. Some things, sort of bring back problems for me at times. But that didn't stop us. And then the Freedom Riders came, but we had early vacation, spring break, and then school was out. So we transferred from Jackson State to Tougaloo College. The Freedom Riders came. And oh my God, it was just a new day for me. It was beautiful, because I met all these young college students from across the country in the body of Diane Nash, James Bevel, Tom Hayden, the late Tom Hayden, Casey Hayden. Oh, I still smile when I see them, John Lewis and Marion Barry and all these young college students. And I thought I was the only person in the world who wanted this kind of thing, but they were all there at the Masonic Temple on 1072 Lynch Street in Jackson, Mississippi. They had just gotten out of Parchman Penitentiary. A lot of them were on their way to their homes and so forth, and some set up an office there on Lynch Street, which was named for the the U.S. Representative J.R. Lynch, who had served during Reconstruction. So when I saw them, it was like, oh my God, I'm so glad to see you. And they set up an office on Lynch Street. And next door to the office was Medgar Evers' office. And so it was just like back and forth. And I was a student at Tougaloo, and when Tougaloo was on the outside of Jackson, whenever I had an opportunity to get into a car and come into Jackson, we would come in and meet these students and sit there and talk about our beloved community, why we should practice nonviolence, how to do community organizing. It was just, I was so absorbed and so wrapped up in it, and Tougaloo would allow us to come in as long as we did our work. So every opportunity I had, I would go there. Then they had the Freedom House, the first Freedom House on Rose Street. And we would go there and sit down and talk. In 1962, I went to the Mississippi Delta. And that was where I met Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, who was on the plantation and who had been in a semi-slavery situation. And I, along with a lot of other students and Bob Moses, were able to get her off the plantation and to go to register to vote with 30 some other people. And she was kicked off the plantation. But that didn't stop anything. That didn't stop it. It made Mr. Hamer and all the others more determined to try and get their freedom. When Milo kicked Miss Hamer off the plantation, he freed her. And she didn't worry about going back because she told him she didn't go to register for him when he told her to go take her name off. She said, I didn't go to register for you, I went to register for myself. And he said, well, you'll have to go. So she left. But her husband had to stay there in servitude because that semi-slavery system meant that they were working for nothing. The husband had to stay there and finish the crop, and then he could leave. So, and when they moved into the McDonald's house in Rouville, Mississippi, it was shot into several times. And by that time, we had moved into Amson Moore's house in Cleveland, Mississippi, and started working in the community. And I visualize this is because what I'm doing now is seeing myself move from the Emmett Till situation to the Fannie Lou Hamer situation up in the Delta that I had so feared, so very, very much. You cannot realize the nightmares that I was going through thinking about Emmett Till. Now I was in his part of the territory, and I had begun to release some of that fear, that anxiety from my spirit after I got into the area and started working and trying to bring about change and trying to erase the hatred that existed. I've never been one who wanted to carry hatred. I couldn't understand why people hated, because it doesn't do anything for you, but it helps to destroy that spirit that we dwell on. We live by faith, and faith is what takes us through every day of our lives. And when I started working full time, I dropped out of college 3 times to work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a student organization. And we practiced nonviolence. And I felt that if I could not stay in school because I wanted to bring about a change. And to this day, right now, I see us going back through some of the things that I've just enumerated to you, but we cannot go back. We cannot go back. We will not go back. As long as we are living and we see each other as human beings, we believe in humanity, we will not go back to from whence we came when all this hatred was being perpetuated. And thank you.
So now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Seth Levy is the Director of Marketing at the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC. He has been with the Southern Poverty Law Center since 2009. Prior to joining the SPLC, Seth was the Director of Strategic Initiatives for an at-large Philadelphia City Councilman and worked for Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell in a variety of capacities, including Deputy Campaign Manager. He holds degrees from Cornell and Columbia Universities. Mr. Levy's talk is entitled, How White Nationalism Fuels Hate. All set?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Hello. So I just want to start off by thanking the Lincoln Cottage for inviting the Southern Poverty Law Center here to speak today. And for those who don't know who we are, we're a civil rights organization headquartered in Montgomery, Alabama. We were founded in 1971 to help make the promise of the civil rights movement a reality. And in addition to filing civil rights lawsuits, one of the main things we do is track hate groups in the United States. And we define a hate group as an organization that has beliefs and practices that malign an entire class of people for their immutable characteristics. So the Klan, for example, hates blacks and Jews because they're black and Jewish. So today I want to talk about white nationalism, its history, and what's going on with it today. And 2 points that I hope to convey. One is that racism in America is often deeper than just a raw hatred for another race. It's often tied to a fear that white hegemony is going to come to an end. Now, this obviously doesn't apply to all hate groups and all racists, but many hate groups and their members tend to follow an ideology where a white nationalist ideology where they believe the white race is under siege by people of color and immigrants. And this is certainly the case, with neo-Nazis, with the Klan, with neo-Confederates, and other groups like that. Next point I hope to convey is that you don't have to wear a white robe and burn a cross to be a white nationalist. There are many white nationalists today that look like you or me, that they have master's degrees and they never say anything overtly racist, but they are still driven by this motivation and goal to keep America majority white because they loathe people who are not white. So with that, let me get into it. This fear that white supremacy is going to come to an end really is rooted in Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, Southern Democrats were cast out of power in the South. African Americans were elected to public office, and this is when whites suddenly realized that, hey, white supremacy in America may not be eternal. And it's during this period that the Ku Klux Klan is founded, sort of in reaction to whites being cast out of power. And one of the Klan's goals was to try and prevent African Americans from voting so that whites could then retake state legislatures. And the federal government was able to successfully put down the Klan. They were very short-lived in this period, but Reconstruction soon came to an end, and white Southern Democrats took back control of the state legislatures and moved very quickly to pass Jim Crow laws, which did then enshrine their supremacy into the law. And it was highly successful, and things for whites in the South was smooth sailing for a couple decades. And then around the 19-teens, there was a new threat to white supremacy, which was immigrants. Beginning at the end of the 19th century, there was a huge wave of Jewish, Irish Catholic, Italian, and German immigrants into the United States. And white Protestants felt that these immigrants were going to dilute their power. And so the Klan during this period makes a roaring comeback. They eventually have millions of members nationwide. And their membership reaches its apex in 1924 with the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act, which severely restricted immigration and outright banned it from Asian countries. In the Klan, they were huge vocal supporters of this law. And after its passage, their numbers go back into decline. But then, in the 1950s, when the civil rights movement picks up and begins to attack and take down Jim Crow, once again, the Klan makes a comeback and other white nationalist groups begin to swell in numbers. Eventually, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts are passed and Jim Crow does come to an end, and these groups go into decline. Now, I'm going to get to modern times, and first I'm going to go to 1970. But before I get there, something else really important happens in the mid-60s, which is the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act, which undid the 1924 Act. And the 1965 Act has had a lot of impact on where we are today with immigration and demographics in the United States. In 1970, only about 4.7% of the US population was foreign born. Today, it's about 14%, which is where it was in 1924. And where immigrants come from today is also radically changed thanks to the 65 Act. In 1970, it used to be about 84% of immigrants came from either Canada or Europe. Today, it's about 14%. And we're also, at a point where, whites will no longer be a majority in our lifetime. Sometime in about 2040, the white population will be under 50%. So now, moving forward, 1970, we get up to David Duke, who is a really big transformational character in the world of white nationalism. Duke really, he was the Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Louisiana, and he begins to soften up some of the rhetoric of the Klan. He begins to frame things as the Klan being more pro-white rather than anti-black. Duke was also very media savvy. I mean, the reason why he's probably the most well-known white supremacist was because he was never shy to go on TV. He also knew how to build the Klan's membership. He opened it up to Catholics, to women, and to teens. But ultimately, Duke realized that he really wasn't accomplishing his goals to preserve a white majority and strengthen white power in the United States. The Klan under his leadership was involved in, various PR stunts like Freedom Rides North to protest school busing in Boston, but none of it really amounted to anything. He realized that to achieve his goals, he needed political power. And so at the end of the 70s, he hangs up his white robes, puts on a suit, and begins running for office. And, he does eventually win election to the Louisiana State House and nearly became governor. And, when Duke runs for office, he's very good at toning down his rhetoric, but his underlying white nationalist ideology is still there. When he runs for president in 1992, at his campaign kickoff speech, very calmly, he says the major issue this election is immigration. Immigrants are coming into this country and they're destroying American values and traditions, including singing Christmas carols. Another issue that he pointed to in his 1992 campaign was crime in cities, saying that, crime's out of control, you can't walk down the street safely anymore. So according to Duke, the problem with America in 1992 was immigrants who are destroying American values and traditions, and minorities, people who tended to live in cities. So, there are obviously other people wearing suits in the 90s who were doing the exact same thing. He wasn't alone. But it is pretty remarkable how far he was able to get and to mainstream. Just a decade ago, this was a guy who was a grand wizard in the Klan. And other white nationalists begin doing the same thing in the end of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And what we started to see at the Southern Poverty Law Center were hate groups being founded in the 80s that were masquerading as these public policy think tanks, that their overriding goal was to still push a white nationalist ideology to preserve a white majority for the United States, but they knew, like Duke, they can't just come out and say that because it's going to alienate people. And so what they do is you have groups like the Federation for Americans for Immigration Reform, or FAIR, are founded. And FAIR was founded in 1979 by a guy named John Tanton, who was a very open white nationalist. He says very explicitly he wants to preserve the white majority, preserve a white majority in America. Its president, Dan Stein, has said that the 1965 Immigration Act was passed by people who wanted to retaliate against Anglo-Saxon dominance. So it's very clear what FAIR believes, but they're also very careful never to say these things. And so what their tactic is, their main goal is to undo the 1965 Immigration Act. And so what their tactic is to try and demonize and fearmonger against immigrants to try and get the general American public on their side. And so they do this by issuing totally bogus white papers where they claim that immigrants are costing the economy $100 billion every year. They depict immigration enforcement in the United States as being completely out of control and being sabotaged by people like Barack Obama. When immigration reform legislation is proposed, they attack it, claiming that it's going to allow immigrants to commit crimes and escape criminal prosecution. And there are lots of other groups out there that are just doing the exact same thing. There's the Center for Immigration Studies, founded in 1985. And they're even bolder in their false claims. Recently, for example, they were grossly inflating the number of immigrants who were involved in terrorism cases since 9/11, with the ultimate goal of trying to scare Americans into thinking that all immigrants are involved in terrorism and that's why we need to restrict immigration. So to get us all the way up to modern times, probably one of the most right now noteworthy white supremacist or white nationalist leader is Richard Spencer. Richard Spencer, he's another guy who has seen what David Duke and other white nationalists have done in the past. And he is, very careful to, just be a warm and charming guy. He's always very well dressed. In fact, the media likes to always talk about how well dressed he is. He's also very careful in what he says. He often talks about trying to protect white civil rights. But ultimately, this is a guy who has said that he wants to found an Aryan homeland in the United States for dispossessed whites, and that he's called for a peaceful ethnic cleansing to preserve Anglo-Saxon culture in the United States. And what's also particularly noteworthy about Richard Spencer is that he's the guy who coined the term alternative right or alt-right, which I'm sure everyone here has heard of. And the alt-right movement is really just, again, a rebranding of white nationalism, mainly made up of young white men who just viciously hate multiculturalism, political correctness, immigration, feminism. And I think one thing really quickly that really doesn't get talked too much about with the alt-right is just how much it hates multiculturalism and political correctness. And that's because these things work. Anytime and something happens on a college campus where students or faculty do something to promote diversity, there's some kind of program, and it's maybe a little flaky, a little lofty, people on the alt-right, right-wing bloggers just immediately pounce on it, saying, it's another example of millennial snowflakes being coddled, it's liberalism run amok. And again, the reason they're attacking it is because they want to put an end to it. And this is also one of the reasons why Richard Spencer and other alt-right personalities like Milo Yiannopoulos are constantly going to college campuses and doing speaking tours, because they do want to put a stop to it. So, where we are today is, I guess, where we are in a situation where, again, a white majority is going to come to an end. When white nationalists talk about this, they are absolutely right. They fear it, and they're going to do everything they can to either stop it or to at least preserve their power when they suddenly find themselves in a minority. And we're also at a point where it's becoming a lot harder to tell who are the bad guys, because they're no longer wearing white robes and burning crosses. Now, certainly there's, many people, for instance, who feel that our immigration policy should be changed, who are not white nationalists in any way. In fact, it's probably the overwhelming majority. But there are people out there that for them it is all about the preservation of a white majority, because they just loathe non-whites. And I'm sure none of us want to support them, and it's just becoming harder and harder to figure out, who are those people. And last and final thing I want to say is that I don't think any of us really appreciate how good the internet has been for white nationalism. That, obviously people believe what they read on the internet. Whatever they read, they believe it. And maybe, the worst horrible example of this is somebody like Dylan Roof, where he credits his own radicalization to going to Google searching black on white crime, and then getting to the Council of Conservative Citizens website, and then just reading their false narrative about how the majority of murders in the United States are committed by African Americans against whites. And this isn't like something that's fringe on the internet that's hard to find. It's all over the internet. You even had one of the presidential candidates during the election retweeting black on white crime memes. I mean, this stuff is all over the place. And even another a sort of quick example of this is that there's been polling done where a majority of whites believe that they are as much, if not more, victims of discrimination than African Americans. And all the empirical evidence shows that's totally not true. But they believe it. And they didn't just, stumble upon this idea, didn't just pop into their heads on its own. They read it somewhere on the internet. They saw something posted on Facebook. They didn't know where it came from, but they saw it, so they believe it. And, I guess I don't have anything really uplifting to leave you with. But I think what's making this current situation, so difficult is that we can't have an honest, debate or discussion about race and racism in America because basic facts are now under dispute. And, yeah. So that's what I have for you. Thank you.
Okay. Start back. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Alex Narasta is an immigration policy analyst at Cato Institute. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. His academic publications have appeared in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Fletcher Security Review, and Public Choice. Alex has appeared on numerous television and radio stations across the United States and is the co-author with Mark Krikorian of the Center for Immigration Studies of the booklet Open Immigration, Yay and Nay. He is a native of Southern California and received a BA in economics from George Mason University and a Master of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics. Mr. Narasta will be speaking to us about tips for debating immigration. Alex.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start with an uncontroversial statement. That's that people are very bad at talking to each other about disagreements. Now, I think politics produces terrible disagreements because each of us individually has a very low chance of changing the outcomes of any political decision. There are hundreds of millions of voters or potential voters in the United States, and I think because everybody knows this to be mathematically true, we all behave emotionally on a lot of political issues rather than thinking about things rationally, and thus we end up with policies based on a lot of feelings rather than a lot of facts. So what's the point of learning about something like economics or the law or public policy or sociology, all these issues that should inform our opinion on these things, if your increase in knowledge won't change or influence the outcomes of this, if you're just one person out of hundreds of millions? Now, as a result, people can persist in really silly, erroneous, wrong beliefs for long periods of time in politics, whereas they don't as much in their personal lives. So I'll sort of just give you an example right now. If you thought your car would run on sugar, you learn very rapidly and very quickly that you were wrong, and you pay a very high cost for that. However, if you believe that socialism or protectionism or nativism or any other kind of bad way of running a country is the path to prosperity and freedom, you could persist in that belief for your entire life and not ever be told you're wrong because your ignorant opinion would have an effect mainly on other people, not on yourself. So that's a problem that I think is for every single political issue. Now, when everybody thinks and behaves this way, that's why you get bad policies, and that's why they can last for a long time. And terrible politicians, and even worse political debates, which I think sounds familiar for anyone who's been paying attention for politics forever, but especially in the last election. And I think the debate over immigration is the worst of all. So I'm on Twitter, which is a cesspool, not out of any personal desire to be in the sewer, but because it's part of my job. And I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of tweets since basically mid-2015 saying things like this. This is one I received on January 25th, 2017. I tweeted out an article about one of the policies that the new Trump administration was going to do and why I thought that was a bad idea. And it's, quote, "Alex, don't worry, you're going to a camp soon and there is nothing you can do about it, traitor." Now, my reaction is actually to laugh too, because it happens every day, hundreds of times sometimes in the course of like a small period of time. And they're mostly anti-Semitic or focused on other type of stuff like that. But that's sort of the tenor, at least, of the online debate that I've witnessed. So I think the debate in person is a little better. Debate on TV and radio, I think, is better than that because people can identify themselves and they're not anonymous. But I don't think it's so different to be unrecognizable. And I just want to run through, I think, a few tips, a few things I've learned in debating this topic for about a decade about how to change some minds and some things to do and not to do, sort of rules of thumb. So first thing is people do change their minds when they're confronted with facts, especially about immigration. It's a recent, very interesting paper. I'll give you the citation later if you want. But these three academics, they did an experiment where they took a large sample of people, Americans and Brits, and they divided it up by country. And they took half of them and put them sort of to the side and asked them their opinions about immigration, and they scored them. And then the other half, though, they took them aside and they gave them some uncontroversial facts about immigration. Just things like, the actual percentage of the population that's foreign-born, where they come from, how many are unauthorized or undocumented, how likely they are to work. facts that almost everybody agrees on are true, people who are anti-immigration and pro. Now, what's interesting is the more knowledgeable group was far more supportive of immigration after they did the polling, even controlling for everything else. So controlling for political opinion, controlling for age, controlling for education, everything else. And the biggest increase in support for liberalized immigration actually was amongst Republicans in this group. So the lesson is that people do change their minds when they learn facts. So don't start with the controversial facts. Don't start with the contested facts. Don't start with the ones that are being debated. Start with just the ones that everyone can agree on. Second, there is no silver bullet argument. I call it the silver bullet fallacy. There is no silver bullet argument that will convince everybody to be more supportive of immigration or probably any other issue also. There are three big groups of voters on this topic. There are those who are going to disagree with you, obviously, those who agree with you, and those who don't really have an opinion, or they're really wishy-washy, or they're really weak in their opinions. No single argument will appeal to all of these people. You're going to find people who agree with you, who disagree with your argument, people who disagree with you, who agree, and people in the middle who don't care, one way or the other. However, the main people that you should, I think, appeal to are those who are in the middle, who don't have a strong opinion yet. Like, you're never going to convince the Representative Steve Kings of the world, to support radically liberalized immigration, and you're not going to support others or convince others who oppose immigration to be on your side. But by debating them in a respectful and reasonable way, making a good case, you are trying to appeal to people in the middle. You're not trying to change Steve King's mind. You're trying to change the minds of the people who are listening to this debate, who are in the middle. That's what your goal is when you go on the news and talk to Tucker Carlson, debate him about immigration. You're not going to convince him. You're going to convince, hopefully, his arguments, his audience. And the arguments you use should be varied. You should use many different ones based on culture, history, values, safety, economics, all different types of things. You shouldn't focus on one. So use them all. Use every one that comes to your mind, because only all of them together can you be successful enough to persuade enough people to really change the tenor of the debate. Now, the third lesson is that human brains are wired in a lot of odd ways that cause us and prompt us to make systematic errors or to be biased in predictable ways. Now, our minds do not view reality objectively. We are instead honed by evolution to guide us in ways to survive living in a primitive environment in the wild. Those skills are not necessarily good for surviving in a modern technological society where we have to deal with statistics and analyzing complex problems that affect billions of people. We are psychologically, therefore, ill-suited for some modern judgments as a result. So psychologists and behavioral economists have identified a particular quirk called the availability heuristic. Now, this is a fancy word, fancy phrase. It basically means that when you think of something or a concept that's a little abstract, you go to the most extreme version of that thing possible immediately in your brain. So I'm going to do a quick experiment with all of you. Terrorism. Now, when I hear the word terrorism, I immediately think about 9/11. I bet that's especially for most Americans. I think of when I was 17 and watching it on TV when I came from high school. The Twin Towers come down and like thousands of people dying and all the fear, the rumors about other airplanes and this and that that were going on. And most people think of this or other tragedies when they hear terrorism. Now, this is a problem because most terrorism is not like 9/11 at all. 9/11 was the deadliest terrorist attack in world history by a factor of 4 to 10. Depending on how you count it. 4 to 10 times as deadly as the next deadliest terrorist attack. It is an outlier in the statistical definition of the word. Out of the 154 foreign-born terrorists who were either convicted of terrorism on U.S. soil, trying to do a plot attack here, or who actually committed their attack on U.S. soil who are foreigners, from 1975 to the end of 2015, 114 didn't kill anybody in their attack. They were losers. They failed. In their attack. Now, they may have tried to murder people, but they did not succeed, thankfully. Now, that's the most common outcome. But how many people think of a loser who didn't murder anybody when they think of terrorism? Nobody. Nobody thinks of that, but that is the most common outcome. Now, few people think, however, of the millions of people punished by our anti-terrorism policies. Not many people think about the trillions of dollars that we've spent on fruitless wars or killing hundreds of thousands of foreigners for no good reason. Because of an overreaction to these small threats. We don't think about that either. So as a result, our view of reality is radically warped toward contemplating the worst possible outcomes. Now, this is true when people think about crime, terrorism, immigration, environmentalism, or just about any other event. So you need to take this into account because there's no change in human psychology. There's only rolling with the punches. The Soviet Union tried for 80 years to change human psychology, and we know what happened to them. Don't rely on non-representative anecdotes in your thinking or judging about what is correct, but use anecdotes in discussing the threat with other people. I'm going to give you an example. Talk about Jose Padilla. We all heard about Jose Padilla? No. So he was a man, so-called, he was a terrorist mastermind, convicted in the United States, eventually after being held in solitary confinement for years. He wanted to build a dirty bomb, and he wanted to kill thousands of people. And a dirty bomb is a radiological bomb supposed to cause radiation and kill a bunch of people. Now his plan, this mastermind, his plan was to construct a centrifuge to concentrate nuclear material so it could be really super deadly and to make a bomb deadly enough to kill thousands. And you know how he was going to construct his centrifuge to do this? He was going to put radioactive material in a bucket, tie a rope to it, and swing it around his head really fast. This is the terrorist mastermind that I think people should be thinking about more when they think about terrorism rather than the handful of successful people. Now, I try another tactic as well when I talk about immigration and terrorism. I discuss the annual chance of dying in a terrorist attack committed by a foreign-born person on U.S. soil. Now, people laugh when I tell them the odds are 1 in 3.6 million a year from all foreign-born people on U.S. soil. Now, people are terrified, of course, most of refugees now, specifically Syrians committing terrorism on U.S. soil. But do you know how many Americans have been killed by refugee terrorists on U.S. soil in a terrorist attack? 3 since 1975. 3. All of them in assassinations targeting individual people, because assassinations count as terrorism, all in the 1970s. Now, what does that mean for your odds? Let's say this goes forward. That means your annual chance of being murdered by refugee terrorists is 1 in 3.64 billion a year. Billion with a B. Put that in comparison. I don't like to compare terrorism to things like slipping in a bathtub because I think it's different. Intentional actions, I think, is what we need to compare these to. So just to put it by comparison, your chance of being murdered in a normal run-of-the-mill homicide is 1 in 14,218 a year. About 256,000 times as great as your chance of being murdered by a terrorist refugee. So in short, I'm going to say stop worrying about it. Almost anything you all did today was much more dangerous, including just walking around the streets of DC, minding your own business. Fourth lesson is to, I think, accurately understand why your opponents believe what they do and why they disagree with you. Now, I said earlier, a lot, and some of that disagreement comes from ignorance. But I recommend do not call them names or assume why they disagree with you without any kind of evidence. Ask them why, in an open-minded way. Allow them to talk and to give you their answer. Be charitable to their disagreements. The most positive light you can possibly take on the reasons that they give you. Prod them and poke them and ask them questions. Ask yourself, quote, if what this person said was true, would a reasonable person change their mind to agree with this person? And then, that's where the facts come in. That's where polite argument comes in. That's where letting them know about these things in a nice way. Few people change their minds after being called names, after being called a racist or be called an anti-American or saying you hate America, you hate all this stuff and you don't care. Well, there's a few people change their minds after that. But some people do if you present the facts in a nice way, in a respectful way, and that is one of your only chances. Political psychology points to an interesting tactic in trying to convince people about immigration. They have a subtopic of this psychology literature called the locus of control. So basically, people are more supportive of immigration if they think the government has control over it. If they think the government doesn't have control over it, they think it's all chaotic and they're anti and they think it's all bad. And this explains a lot of the difference in opinion across countries. So Canada and Australia, the populations there are much more open to immigration than the United States or the United Kingdom. They have much higher percentages of their country that are foreign-born in the United States. In Canada, 20%, about 21% foreign-born. Australia, 29%. US, it's only 14. In the UK, it's about 12. Now, part of the reason why that is people in Canada think that their government has control over immigration. They don't have a long border with a country that sends a lot of immigrants to the United States. So it's easy to say there's no chaos, we can control this stuff. Australia, it's the same thing. In the 90s, there was a big surge of people coming in boats to Australia as refugees, landing on the shore. People were really upset about this in Australia. Public opinion for immigration plummeted. The government got control of that, put these people in horrible detention facilities and islands, lots of human rights abuses, but they got them off of the shores. Australian public opinion went back up to where it is today, and now there's 29% of the population is foreign-born. United Kingdom, if you recently saw the Brexit vote, a big part of that is that British people thought their government didn't control immigration anymore. They were part of the European Union. Europeans could come and go to the UK as they wish. They didn't have sort of a border with this anymore. People felt like they were out of control. Now, that's a good policy. Makes everybody richer. But they didn't feel like they're in control. In the United States, the obvious one is the southern border with Mexico. People don't feel like there's control. So as long as there's a perception that the border is open on the southwest, people will be more skeptical of liberalized immigration. Now, the facts are obvious. The southwest border has never been more under control, at least since the 1970s. But facts don't matter in democracies as much. Feelings do. And the feeling is that immigration is out of control. But feelings eventually catch up with facts. It takes a long time. But hammering again and again, the control is important. But the border is under control. And then an expanded immigration system, a better immigration system, a more liberal and open one, will make it stay under control, I think is a very good way of dealing with their concerns that most people share in a way that says, yes, that is a concern, but if you listen to me, my way of doing things will bring it under control and actually do what you want, while your way of doing things that you want to do won't work. It's a different way. Fifth lesson, and I hate to say this as an economist, is that economic arguments really don't matter that much. I know, right? I know. All this literature, all this years of research. But as Jens Hainmuller and Daniel Hopkins wrote in a wonderful piece recently, a literature review of all the research on immigrant public opinion, quote, as an explanation of mass attitudes toward immigration, the labor market competition hypothesis has repeatedly failed to find empirical support, making it something of a zombie theory. The zombie theory is one of the biggest insults in academic economics. Culture, crime, terrorism, values, humanization of immigrants, and appeals to American history all seem to work a little bit better than these other topics. Now, the sixth lesson is that if you want to talk about economics, then it's probably not the best thing to do. But if you want to talk about it, never talk about competition. Only talk about cooperation. Only talk about how immigrants cooperate with Americans. And fortunately, the literature bears that out too, so you're not even telling a fib. And my last lesson, probably the most unpopular or politically incorrect, but immigration is a very controversial and divisive issue amongst people who debate it. And as a result of that, I don't think it should be combined with other controversial topics. Now, race is another controversial topic in America. Very controversial topic. We hear about it all the time, and I think we should. But I don't think it makes sense to combine the two of them into a big activist push. It's a bad idea. There are people who are persuadable on immigration who are not persuadable on race, and there are people persuadable on race who are not persuadable on immigration, and vice versa. By combining two controversial topics, you get negative synergy, and an argument that could appeal to even fewer people in each one. Multiplying a fraction by a fraction produces a smaller number, not a larger one. I know this as a member of a very minority political ideology, that combining with other minority political ideologies does not lead to good outcomes. Talking about immigration is tough enough. Don't talk about other issues as well. Now, to end on an upbeat tone, because I notice a lot of people sort of want to try to do that, and I do think the world is getting better, at least in the long run. I might be a short-run pessimist, but a long-run optimist. The election of Donald Trump did not follow a slide in public opinion against immigration. There is not a noticeable opinion, at least in public opinion polls, that immigration is bad or should be cut off. Since his election, Americans have not really changed their opinions either. Trump won less on policy issues and more on other issues. And just to give you an example, Gallup has been asking since 1965 opinions of Americans. Do you want more immigration, less immigration, or about the same? In the mid-90s, it peaked. 65% of Americans wanted less immigration. 65%. Today, 38%. Dramatic fall off, virtually uninterrupted during that time period. The side that wanted more immigration went from 7% in the mid-90s to 25% today. an almost fourfold increase, versus the other side was cut in half. Now, if I was to give financial advice, and I'm not because that's illegal, and if these were stocks and bonds and you had to buy one, I would say the pro-immigration side is the one that is an appreciating asset, and the anti-immigration side is the one that is a depreciating asset in the long run. So to end on a positive note, although there is an election of a president who is opposed to immigration, legal and unlawful in the United States, that is not reflected in public opinion, and it's not likely to stick in the long run. So thank you.
Okay, I am pleased to introduce our next and final speaker. Rebecca Barrett Fox studies the intersections of hate, religion, sexuality, and gender in a U.S. context. See, you're not supposed to talk about immigration and race together, but Rebecca is going to talk to us about all those things. She is the author of last year's God Hates, Westboro Baptist Church, American Nationalism and the Religious Right, an ethnographic account of America's most famous anti-gay church that seeks to place Westboro Baptist Church in the context of American Christianity more broadly, some of the work that she's going to share with us today. Rebecca is also the most recent guest editor of the Journal of Hate Studies and the co-editor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Hate, a global study of social enmity. Dr. Barrett Fox's work has appeared in Religion and Popular Culture, Radical Teacher, Religion Dispatches, and elsewhere. She is an assistant professor at Arkansas State University and blogs at anygoodthings.com. And her talk today is entitled Measuring Hate by Its Consequences. Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I want to say again, thank you to the Lincoln Cottage and to my co-presenters today. I feel very fortunate to get to go last because I've got to learn so much more already. And obviously thank you to you all for coming out for what could be a hard discussion. And I think Alex's presentation reminds us about how hard these conversations can be to have. So I want to start with a story about Matthew Snyder. He was 20 years old and a Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps when in 2003 he was killed in Iraq in a non-combat operation. His Humvee rolled over. He was killed instantly. He was born in York, Pennsylvania. That's close to where I'm from in Lancaster. But his parents had divorced and his mother lived in Westminster, Maryland, about 70 miles from here. And so his body was brought back for burial here with a funeral at a Catholic church in Westminster. And his parents, during that time period, had a few days while the body, between when they received the news and when the body was returned, to prepare for what can be only the worst possible thing, right? Burying a child. They were preparing for that, planning the funeral, and there was another group in Kansas also preparing themselves for this funeral. And that was Westboro Baptist Church. It's a church of about 70 people. About half of them are children because they don't practice birth control, so they have a lot of kids. And they picket every single day in the US. And they've been picketing since 1991, and in the early 2000s, they started picketing military funerals. And Matthew Snyder's funeral was one of the first military funerals they picketed. Mm-hmm. And so when they prepare for a funeral, they practice what they're going to say to people on the picket line. They might actually practice songs that they're going to sing on the picket line. They prepare signs, picket signs, that say things like, Matthew's in hell, or Marines die, God laughs. Right? And then they traveled out to Westminster for the funeral. As they got close to the funeral, one of the church members, Shirley Phelps Roper, who was a spokesperson for the church at the time, turned on the radio and she heard an interview with Albert Snyder, Matthew's father. And in that interview, she said she heard how sad Albert Snyder was about his son's death, right? He was heartbroken, and he was angry too, right? He was mad about the war, he was mad about this unnecessary death, he was mad about what he was going to have to mourn for the rest of his life. And she said she heard how much he loved his son, and she recognized that because she loves her children, right? Shirley has more than 10 children, and she loves all of them. And I know Shirley and I know her family from my work, and it's true, she loves them intensely. She's a very devoted mother, and there's a lot of warmth in her relationship with her kids. Now, for other people, maybe if you had planned on picking somebody's funeral, and then you heard this radio interview and you thought, I recognize that parent to child love, maybe you'd turn your van around and go back to Kansas, right? That's what you would do, right? That's not what Westboro Baptist does. Right? Shirley explains that, and every church member would agree with this, that because they love is why they pick it. Because they love is why they pick it. So it's a positive motivation that results in a consequence that everybody else would say is hateful. Right? Albert Snyder said it was hateful. He sued them. It went to the Supreme Court. The court found 8-1 for the church. And that was in 2000. 8-1 in favor of the church. The church won that lawsuit. Albert Snyder had to pay their legal costs. Right. That it was heard in November 2010. March 2011, the decision was announced. Right. So the rest of us can say that's a hateful outcome, right? That is a hateful thing to do. But the church says it's done in love. Has anybody seen Westboro Baptist Church in action? Okay.
I think I've seen it on TV.
On TV, okay. Some of you have seen it in person. If you've seen it in person, I'm sorry. I feel like as a person who lived for a long time in Kansas, I have to personally apologize for our representation. And I'm sorry too, because when they show up, it means something went wrong. Something's bad happened. Not always. This week they're picketing a Mariah Carey, Lionel Richie concert. There's nothing wrong with that. That's great. I mean, that's a fine. It's bad to picket. There's no, but it's not tragic. But obviously they do a lot of tragic events. And in my research, I went to a lot of funerals with them and made observations there of their pickets. So that's how they see what they do. A little bit of history about the church. It was founded in 1955 by Fred Phelps, who was a church planner from another congregation in Topeka. The two relationships fell apart pretty quickly, and Westboro Baptist Church became an independent Baptist church. It doesn't have relationships with any other church, any organizational ties. Fred Phelps was actually famous in Topeka for a number of years prior to funeral picketing because he was a civil rights litigator. He won awards from the NAACP. He reopened Brown in the city of Topeka and attempted to get a class action lawsuit going on it. It didn't certify as a class action lawsuit, but it pushed desegregation forward. And so 1955, is also the year that Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka was settled, and he really felt that as a mission to push forward on racial justice. Flash forward to the early 1990s, and the church has started to become famous for its anti-gay picketing. And that can be a hard thing to reconcile. And there's complex reasons why the church was able to and continues to do both things. So the church still has a law office that primarily looks like a relatively progressive law firm. Does child in need of care and public defense a lot. So in the 1990s, the church started anti-gay picketing. In the 2000s, it started anti-military picketing. Fred Phelps was the only pastor of the church until his death about 3 years ago. And now it's led by a rotating group of elders. There's 7 men who occupy the pulpit kind of in turn and lead the congregation now. So why does the church do this? Right? The church would say, if you love someone, you want to warn them. Right? And so one of their picket signs says, love thy neighbor equals rebuke. So the Bible passage from the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. They said, well, if you love someone as you would want to be loved, wouldn't you want to be warned if your life was in mortal danger? Right? If you see somebody about to have a car accident, you hit the horn, right? And they might not like it. They might be scared. They might think you're rude. But once they look up and see that you helped them avert a car accident, they're going to be grateful. So Westboro Baptist Church sees itself in that role of honking the horn, right? So it pickets as a way to honk the horn, to warn you. It's too late for the person who's dead. But for the other people who are here at this funeral, we are here to warn you that you're going to hell. Right? If you don't change your ways, it's hell for you. And that's offensive, right? But they say they choose funerals specifically because funerals are where our emotions are rawest, where we're vulnerable, where we're already asking big theological questions like, why, God, did this happen? How am I supposed to go on? And they think you're going to be most open to hearing the word of God there. Now, empirically, I know of no one who has joined the church because you picketed, they picketed your son's funeral, right? It's not an effective form of reaching people if what you want is for people to join the church. Now, the church has more complicated theology than that. They would say that also when you hear them speak, when you encounter them, you're going to either think, I just heard the voice of God. Right? And that means you're going to want to join their church, move to Topeka and picket with them. Or you're going to think, those are the worst people imaginable. How hateful. And when you think that, and when you make that decision that you're going to reject them, then you've also rejected the Word of God. And so their goal isn't to, quote unquote, get you saved like you might hear from other churches. It's to help you understand if you're going to heaven or not. So if you reject them, that means that you're hellbound. Right? So they would also consider that a victory or a win for them. Right? It doesn't matter if you convert as long as you know the truth. Right? So in this comparison to them thinking that what they are doing is loving, this is something that church members as well as ex-members consistently say. Right? If you ask them, why do you do something hateful? They say, it's not hateful, right? It's ultimately loving because it's going to save you from hell. And if it causes you temporary discomfort, that's still better than an eternity of hellfire. So that's kind of extremist logic. It's, like I said, it's not very effective. It doesn't really win people to their side. But you can imagine other places where we say similar things. So if that's an extremist example, let's back up to some non-extremist examples. Remember at some point you were a teenager and you probably said something to your parents, something like, you hate me, right? Your parents hate, of course your parents didn't hate you, right? But you're pretty sure, you're not just saying it, you felt that they hated you, right? And they said, no, it's not that I hate you, it's just I'm saying no, I'm taking the car keys, you can't hang out with that person because I love you, right? That's why it feels like hate to you. And because you're a teenager, it feels really like hate. And you can't quite get the scope down that this is not really hate, but it feels that way. Look at a different example with children. We know that hitting children has incredibly negative consequences, right? We have decades of research that tells us that both outright child abuse as well as what we legitimize as spanking or corporal punishment. Millions of children in the US are subject to corporal punishment through their schools. All of that has bad outcomes for kids, right? It has really hateful outcomes for kids on individual lives. But what do we do as we're inflicting it on them? What do we say? We say, this hurts me more than hurts you, right? That's a lie, right? But what you're telling them is, I am sacrificing. I am making the sacrifice of inflicting pain upon you for some greater good. Westboro Baptist Church does the same thing. They spend $250 million a year traveling. It's a $250,000 a year budget. It is all self-funded. They make big tithes from their own pockets to travel. Once you become a young adult, you're expected to pay for your own way in traveling. Do a tremendous amount of traveling every single day. They picket. Next week, they're down in Las Vegas with a little tour of college campuses and high schools to picket. Right? They sacrifice money, they sacrifice time, they sacrifice friendship, reputation, potential marriage partners. They're losing big time, right, when they go out and picket. But they represent, for them, they're going to say that that's an act of love and of sacrifice to very ungrateful audiences, right? Eventually they think that they're going to pick somebody up, they're going to help people understand the truth. So that is their reward. They also say that they have to be obedient to God, and God is calling them to do this. Let's look at a different example. Last week we dropped 59 bombs in Syria, right? Yesterday, Eric Trump is speaking in a British newspaper and says, well, my sister Ivanka, she saw those pictures of Syrian children suffering. And Ivanka's a mother, right? That's why she's the chosen Trump child to make this argument. Because she's a mother, she understood how those other Syrian parents were suffering. She understood what it means to love your child, just like a Syrian parent loves your child. And so she went to our father and she made this persuasive argument, weighed in on why we should bomb in Syria. That's an argument based on love, right? Love of children. It's an argument that has hateful outcomes, dead civilians, right? So we have hateful outcomes out of a place of love. So if we think about other things that we love that are good, noble, fitting, right things to love, our families, our country, our religion, we honor love of those things. We create monuments, right, to express our love for those things. And yet we can also love them to the exclusion of caring about anything else and in defense of harming others. Seth gave us the example of the Klan. The Klan's not going to make the argument, the alt-right's not going to make the argument that we need to hate people of color. That argument's underlying there, right? It's there. Right? But they're going to make the argument that you do this because you love your white people, right? Right? It's not that we want bad things for black people. It's just that it's not wrong to love your race. I'm coming from Arkansas. There's a town there called Harrison. It's a very, very active white supremacy community, and they have a billboard up in the town that says just that. It's not wrong to love your race, right? And it's for white people. If black people can be proud of being black, why can't white people be proud of being white? And so these are no longer arguments about why slavery was a good thing or why Jewish people should go to concentration camps. They're just conversations about how we should love people who are like us and the people we're responsible for. Right? We should love our religion. We should love our children. Who do we need to protect? Who did the Klan say it needed to protect? Well, of course, it needed to protect white women, right, and white children. And white women, as a white woman, I feel like I can say this, we get used all the time in this argument. Boy, if white men cared about white women as much as some white men say they care about some white women, wouldn't the world look different? Yeah, these are, you know, if we really cared about children, if Ivanka Trump really cared about Syrian children, we'd see a different situation than we already see. But we exploit these things because appeals directly to hate are impolite and they're ugly. It doesn't take very far to go on the internet to find them. Alex gave us an example of Twitter, right? The cesspool people are going to say anti-Semitic things there all the time. You don't have to go into the dark web, you know, to find these things. They're right there. But in polite company, in news releases, in public debates, we're not going to say those arguments. Instead, we're going to say it's not about hurting other people. It's just about loving the people that we should care for. I don't ever want to appear as an apologist for Westboro Baptist Church. I think we can understand, we can comprehend Westboro Baptist Church without being understanding toward them. I don't think we need to be empathetic to them. The results that they produce are hateful. And that, I think, is enough to judge judge a group, to say if it's if it's good or bad, or we should support it or not support it, or give it space or not give it space. But if we take the extremist models, and I think you could do it with Westboro Baptist Church, you could do it with neo-Nazis, you could do it with anti-Muslim groups, you could do it with the Klan. If we look at the models that they give us, I think we can ask other questions, or illustrate other questions for groups that are more nuanced, where we might not see that something that we think is loving or lovable or good or noble can also be used for extremist or violent or hateful or destructive ends. And so Westboro Baptist Church is small, 70 people. It's going to get bigger for a while because they're demographically, if about half your children leave the church, that sounds like a big deal. But if you've got 12 children, and you've got still six inside, so actually their growth rate is they're going to be successful just in demographics for a while longer. But they're pretty tight, right? They have some support from outsiders, some people who send them checks, but they're not a nationwide movement. Okay. What they can show us, though, is how do groups that are less offensive and less extremist, less overtly hateful, use similar tactics to get us to buy in to things that are really lovely to justify ends that are really not. That's what I want to share today. Thank you.
So we now want to have a conversation. And I would love to sort of open it up to people's comments and questions. I just wanted to mention two things that may or may not spark more questions or some responses from our panelists. Two of the things that I was thinking of as you were talking are again, with my work with museums, two of the trends in museums lately they're not oppositional in any way, but they some way take us on a different track. One is an emphasis on dialogue and conversation, facilitated dialogue. So museums moving away from places where you come to us, we tell you facts. And I was thinking a lot about this in Alex's talk about how we can change minds with facts. The museum literature should be reading your stuff more, maybe, because the museum literature sort of says, we have people for an hour, we're never going to change anybody's mind, but what we can do is have a conversation that might actually give people other perspectives. So what is the role of dialogue in any of these sort of larger problems of hatred and its implications? The other thing that museums have been thinking about a lot lately, and this is not just museums, this is sort of all over the culture right now, is the question of empathy. So maybe it's not so important that museums, again, deliver lots of facts, but rather create experiences where people might be able in some small way to put themselves in someone else's shoes. And so Rebecca's beginning point, I was like, oh, this is going to be about empathy. It's the story about, it's another parent who's lost a child, and yet the bus keeps going. So I think the empathy road can be tricky because empathy is emotional, and if we are appealing to emotions as opposed to intellect, we don't really know where that's going to go, and it could go in places we don't want to go. But then the question becomes, but are we looking to direct, or are we looking to open conversations and experiences? So those are the things I was thinking about in terms of my work when I was listening to these really, really interesting presentations. I'm wondering if people have questions or comments, either for each other or from the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to I had no idea that Emmett Till was going to be mentioned here. I have a book that came out the 31st of January of this year, and the title is The Blood of Emmett Till. In 1955, I was in the United States Army. I was in the Navy first, then I went in the Army. That's another story. But I remember that so well. And I remember talking to people over the years, long before this book was ever written. I was talking about. So this one person I mentioned it to, and this person said, well, that was in the past. We should forget it. I said, no, we should think about it now and think about it in the future. That's all I have to say.
You're here. And when Dora was talking about Emmett Till, I was thinking of the role of trauma in all of this. That's a traumatic moment. Nationally, it's even more traumatic when you are local, and it's even more traumatic when you are local and young and black. So that people, and yet you were so moved, being older and not sharing his race or his circumstances. So that potential for understanding and being moved by something that's productive, I think, as horrible as it is.
So we do a lot of experiments about public opinion, where we run focus groups, videos, we let people read like a short op-ed and poll them. And we've had a lot of success with short pieces and short videos. Like we had one where we showed people 4 different videos, or different groups, 4 different videos. And one tried to change their mind about Muslim immigrants in the United States, which is like the most difficult sort of topic to talk about. And we had one where there was this Muslim student complaining about bullying, nobody changed their opinion. There was one where there was a Muslim refugee who was a Marine talking about why he loves America, no change. There was a refugee complaining about her family and why she can't bring them over, no change. The video that worked, oddly enough, and it's not for the reason we thought either, was there was a bunch of Muslim Americans who were reading hateful Facebook comments about them, or written about Muslims them, and they were reading them, and they're reacting to them. And one of the most common reactions, one of the most common comments was, well, why don't you go back to your own country? And then the reaction was like, or why don't you get deported? We're like, deported where? Like to the hospital in LA? Like deported to San Francisco? And in asking follow-ups, we asked people like, why did that change their mind? And they said, it's because they're a sound American. So because they sound American. Like, because there's not like, none of the hallmarks of looking or appearing foreign or different or strange, and having, their reaction is what, be deported back to where I'm from the same place you are. And that was unexpected result. So you can do a lot in a museum, I think. I mean, this video is like 30 seconds long. So.
And we were speaking about this a little bit earlier, just for context for everyone. We do tell our team that we're not here to change people's minds, but rather to open them to new ideas. But we have experienced people who came to the site, and Callie had this experience herself, where they didn't believe that slavery was even one of the top 10 causes of the Civil War. And they had actually changed their mind by the end of this experience here. So it's, I think some of it, and we got a little bit of this from Alex's talk, and also from Dory and Seth and Rebecca, that a lot of it is your approach to the conversation.
I think maybe also there's a part of that is, to Seth's point about, I don't know, I'm a historian, so it is incontrovertible to me that slavery was a cause of the war, but if you lay out the factual underpinning of that argument, it's the facts, and that can maybe, shift people.
I read some that the war was agitated by foreign nations for their economic pursuits, but the resolve about it for me was that there was a moral conviction in this country to end slavery, regardless of how it was agitated, regardless of how it was provoked. The resolve is, this is something that should end. And that's how I see that. I mean, naturally, that was the result.
I was talking to Seth Levy, and I'm telling you that I give a lot of support to the Southern Poverty Law Center. I get their magazine, and 1 year I gave a lot of money. They helped, it was I think a DVD they were teaching in the classroom to sort of try to help them to understand tolerance, more tolerance. Are they still using a lot of those type of aids in the classrooms?
Yeah, just to speak about that, I'll try not to be too self-promotional. So one of the things we do is develop original documentary films on a civil rights issue. But really one of the main goals of the films is to get students, to build empathy with for the people that the films are about. So one of them that we did was on anti-gay bullying. And really the purpose of that film was, it was on a real person, a student named James Bosney was bullied in 1997, and he was beat up to the point that he had to get hospital treatment. But anyway, like one of the points is to show students that when you bully, like this is what happens when they come home, and show them what they probably don't always see, and then sort of make them consider their actions and the impact that it has on other people.
I think both of those speak definitely to the importance of speaking to children, working with children, not shielding. I mean, age appropriately, but not shielding, because next thing you know, they're grown-ups.
I think they call it teaching tolerance.
Teaching tolerance.
What I was thinking actually builds on your answer to your question, and that was my takeaway actually from the afternoon is that people who are hating feel wounded, and that people who are on the other end of it are being wounded. And so empathy seems like something that potentially could be used as leverage in that situation, because both are feeling the wound. That's a profound emotional state. And it may be hard to change people over time, but I think there's a way of making benchmarks in their lives to say, just in the case of bullying, this is something you may have experienced, maybe in a little way or maybe in a bigger way. And I think that may be a way to open windows between people.
Yeah, so I wrote that down. People who are hating feel wounded or threatened, I think we could also say. And people who are hated are being wounded.
I've been hearing about violence in Syria and such, and I grew up in a military family, born at Bethesda Naval Hospital, just a little bit around. And it's hard to marry to a Quaker, but it's hard to think about violence and good things and bad things. And when I studied history, and I came away thinking that there was nothing good really that came out of the firebombing of Dresden. You know, even though the British suffered so much from the Luftwaffe and things, that the firebombing of Dresden was terrible. But I think sometimes we miss a lot of nuances. And I heard on NPR one day a few years ago an interview with a concentration camp survivor. And he said they heard on one of the international radios and that someone had somehow been able to make out of, you know, a little radio out of, you know, spare little something, metal parts they found, that Dresden had been destroyed, and it gave his group the will to live. And, you know, then I was left with this feeling of the thousands of people in Dresden who were bombed and displaced and died. On the other hand, this group, if I were to choose a people who deserve to live in those circumstances, it is just so hard to, you know, come up with consequences and what's right and wrong on these dilemmas. And just one more thing, that sometimes having prejudice is fun, you know, I don't think we accept the consequences of that. Again, as the daughter of a World War II veteran, my father hated the Germans. I mean, he hated the Germans, and we made fun of Germans in my house. I was in my 40s before my sister pulled me aside, my older sister, and said, you know, we're part German. My father, I knew Dutch and French, you know, but my father never let that his great-grandmother, Elizabeth Young, was Elizabeth Newman. And that never came. And my husband's mother was a member of the Dutch resistance during World War II and was caught by the Gestapo. And at one point, when our children were significantly younger, we went to Europe. I wanted them to see the prison where she had been held. And so I made a point of paying $400 extra for us not to fly in Lufthansa. And so we flew on British Airways. It was a horrible flight, too. And it was an absolute disaster. And when we were about ready to fly home, there were no spaces on British Airways. And they said, well, we'll give you $200 if you fly Lufthansa.
Here's your moral dilemma.
My husband said, no, that won't be enough for her. And they said $400. And then they said $800. And I said, no. And then he said, well, how about business class? So I was flying for $800 business class. But the plane was the best plane ride ever. You know, the people were lovely. You know, everybody was lovely. And it was really, you know, maybe it's not so fun anymore to have that anti-German.
You should meet my mother. She's the same thing, and we're also German. Yeah, those are, you know, they're passed down, right? That comes from your family, and it's, and I got it too. Because sometimes to reject that prejudice is somehow to reject, if we're honest, to reject something that's important to our family. You know, we make fun of Germans, even though we're German.
Yes, you were talking about the dialogue, the interactive in parts of the museum. And I have had the occasion to be in the Museum of American Indian, and went on a tour with one of the guys in the local Indian museum here. And the guy was so transparent and we could ask questions back and forth, and the dialogue was stimulating and learning. Also, I went to the Skirball Museum in Los Angeles, and the same thing happened. I mean, you learn so much more when you engage in the actual conversation about what is in the museum. And I think that if the museums are moving in that direction, and more people and children and others will be more anxious to get there and to learn more, right?
It's engaging, right? And it's more engaging.
Yes, for me, yes. And children and old people, young people. Because we tend to shy away or just make an annual visit to the museum.
I have a question for, in Trump's campaign promise to build the wall, in your view, was there much white nationalist sentiment in that campaign message?
Oh, here we go. It's the immigration race combo.
I mean, yeah, I think he was certainly trying to make that appeal to, people who, are worried about demographic changes in the United States, that have, some kind of anxiety about it, and want to keep immigrants out, and also just, again, feel that, immigration in this country is just completely out of control, and that it's lawless, and yeah, I think it's definitely making an appeal to that, people who share that anxiety, or even darker belief and ideology.
I don't know if this is appropriate, but I wanted to say that in face of all of what's going on, there's 60 churches in this area, DMV, that have banded together to support immigrants. And the way people are doing it is volunteering to take a training and go with them to their ICE interviews and their court hearings. For me, that's using my white privilege to accompany people who are less privileged and trying to make a difference. And the immigration lawyers are saying that it does improve outcomes when people are accompanied. So you can explore that option on Sanctuary DMV, that's DC, Maryland, Virginia. It's just starting up, and there's probably going to be training in mid-May.
Yeah, and my synagogue is organized the training too, the exact same thing, and it apparently works.
So I went to one in Baltimore that was successful. I am prepared to go to some that are not successful, but it can be useful there to the person emotionally and physically to hold their stuff and while they're doing that, and be able to notify people if they get. But it also highlights the humanity of the person. These aren't violent people. So what we've done is we've sort of criminalized their existence now. Not that they're criminalized because they are immigrants. So I think it's just one thing I wanted to share.
I like this idea about this conversation matter. If some of you might be familiar with Derek Black, there's a big article in November about his departure from white supremacy. He was born into it. His father's a very important white supremacist and became the founder of Stormfront, which is a major internet site for white supremacy. And nobody needed to be patient or kind to Derek Black. I mean, I don't think that anybody owed him that. But he was able to find people who were willing to be with him while he walked out of hate and continued to engage him. He became friends with another student at college who was Jewish, who would consistently bring him into his home, and was really patient while they talked together. And another similar story is Megan Phelps Roper, who was very big in Westboro Baptist Church, did a lot of her social media. She just had a TED Talk that came out maybe 2 weeks ago. It's wonderful. And Megan's, I know Megan, she's a very logical person. She wanted an argument to be set out in front of her in a logical way. Logic and theology is really important to that church. So to be able to speak her language and be patient with her is much more effective than name calling. And I've seen a lot of counter protests where that's the strategy. But it takes I think like a lot of patience to be with a person who's in that position. But we know people change their stories, and they change their minds, they change their behavior. A lot of different levers we can pull to bring people out of hate groups. And one-on-one relationship is a big part of it, because one of the reasons a lot of times that they're in those groups is because those groups give them relationships, right? So they validate them, they give them authority, They give them, make them an expert, right? And the different groups are different, organized differently, but they're special when then they're in that group. And what they don't want to have to give up is being special or being important to someone. This idea of the moral harm or the wounds, I think it's very insightful that we, all of our pain, maybe it's a little, there's Buddhist scholarship on this, right? Like our pain, the way we treat other people comes out of our own pain. But some of these people are wounded in the groups that they're part of, right? They're losing a lot, they're being injured a lot by being in those groups. And they are looking for someone or for people or a support system to help them heal. And the threats that they feel are real. The groups tell them how threatened they are. So in Westboro Baptist Church every Sunday starts with a prayer that says something like this: Dear God, thank you that we're not like those people outside of this church, but I know we're going to heaven. That's a terrible thing to say about other people, but what you're also telling the kids in that church is, if you leave this church, you have no hope of going to heaven. And in interviews with ex-members, I've talked to a lot of people who, some of them are no longer religious at all, they're atheists, but they still say, I'm still terribly afraid that God's going to strike me dead. One woman just said to me this week, every time she goes to get a haircut, because the women in the church aren't permitted to cut their hair, she's sure she's going to be punished by God for cutting her hair. This is 10 years after leaving the church, right? But it's still, their bodies are so disciplined in thinking like that. And so, again, I don't think that it means we owe it to people, but for those of us who are driven to that kind of empathy and compassion, I think there's a lot that compassion and empathy and conversation can pull people up and do work together.
And I think the best example of that is Daryl Davis. So he's a black musician, he lives in Maryland, travels around and he befriends KKK members, and they basically convinces them to give it up over the course of developing a real friendship. So he collects their robes. He has like, I don't know, 50 or like some large number.
They're actual robes.
Like they're actual, so he has them in his house, and he like shows. And there's a wonderful documentary about it called Accidental Courtesy. And you see why he's so effective. He's like the nicest guy in the world. He's like the most non-threatening looking guy in the world, and he's cool. And so just by talking, and has a lot of these conversations on camera, he meets like, the Grand Dragon or Wizard or, some like group, and you just see him like soften, and like over the course of years, how he can convince a lot of these folks. And he's so nice about it. He's not a jerk. And it's a wonderful documentary. I highly recommend it.
Accidental Courtesy?
Yeah, he's amazing. He's a very interesting, amazing man.
Time for one more?
Just had a response to when Alex was speaking, you mentioned a Gallup poll, and it crossed my mind the thought I have since the election about polling, that I just think, oh, well, right, well, we can't really trust polls anymore. And I know it's like with statistics, you can manipulate polls as well to say what you want them to say, but it just seemed like polling, certain kinds of polling in the U.S. used to be kind of reliable, and they're not in a way anymore. And I think, certainly it points to having the discussion, really knowing other people, and across the United States, trying to understand more, where different pockets of people are. But that's hard to do with, everyone. So you do want to rely on something maybe that can kind of coalesce data or opinions, and just what are your thoughts about that?
So in defense of polling, in terms of the outcome of the popular vote, it wasn't that far off, naturally. On some of the state level ones, it was off by a few points, but it was a very close election. Pennsylvania, the numbers were small. There's always a margin of error on these things. But in terms of like getting information about, I guess it's your question, information about this, I love the General Social Survey. It's a great, huge biennial survey. Any sociologist will tell you about it in detail, an economist, it's a wonderful survey about opinions, and they ask about all types of weird stuff that might not even seem like an issue anymore. They keep asking about it. So it's a wonderful data source for that. There's a large number of polls done by universities about, and I don't know so much about the literature on racism or anything like that, but I'm sure there's a lot of very good information out there about it. And the thing is, you don't need to be exactly right. It doesn't matter if it's 27% or 28.5 or 24.2. Like, if it's in the 20s, you can still be close enough.
Well, and you were also talking about change over time versus how people are feeling it.
As a historian, you might be aware of a 1955 short story by Isaac Asimov called The Franchise, and it's about the ultimate poll. It's about an American election being determined by the one most normal voter. I think that's what, if you follow polls, that's what you want. You want to get the answer ahead.
Thank you, everyone.